Alrighty. Well, guys, let me figure this out real fast. I am working on it. Wow, what is this? Stop. There. I think I figured it out. Okay, cool. Sorry about all that. Anyways, yes, so I am going to be teaching today on the history of atheism. I know that we've spent the last several weeks really discussing religions that believe in one God, so Christianity, Islam, Judaism, and of course, the natural thing to do then is to switch from those to start talking about atheism, a religion, really, even though they wouldn't describe themselves that way, but a belief system that pretty much discounts for any God whatsoever. And so we're going to discuss that today. And I wanted to start out by just basically explaining why I think it's a religion, why it is a religion. Every person who believes something based on faith is a religion. It takes just as much faith to believe in God as it takes to not believe in him. And so that's why I'm classifying atheism as a religion. So if you all have any questions about that, obviously, anything really that comes up, just email me. But if you have your outlines, we're going to start at number 1. What is atheism? Of course, that's a good place to start. So basically, the definition of atheism, it's a term derived from the Greek word atheos, A-T-H-E-O-S, which means without God, godless, secular, denying or disdaining the gods, especially officially sanctioned gods. Now, the term atheism was not really coined until the 16th century, but as expected, the idea of there being no God was first brought up that we know of in the 5th century BC by a Greek philosopher. His name was Diagoras of Melos. Diagoras, D-I-A-G-O-R-O-S, of Melos, M-E-L-O-S. And he was really called the first atheist by people today. And well, we'll talk more about him later. So there's different branches of atheism, if you will. And just remember this: in the ancient world, polytheism was the leading philosophy of the day, and so there were very few atheists. Now, of course, polytheists believed in multitudes of gods, many gods, as we talked about. The history of Islam, the history of Christianity, and kind of what the culture that they were embedded in. The same thing. Polytheism was what people believed, and so atheists, they just didn't really exist then in ancient times. But when it did come onto the scene, they tended to be very deeply philosophical and scientific people. They were the elite thinkers of the day, and really the modern, everyday person believed in God or a multitude of gods. And so it was really these elite thinkers that were atheists. Now, there was different ways of thinking. There's 2 different ways to think about, well, actually 3 different ways to think about atheism. The first is true atheism, really those who believe in absolutely no God or gods, 0. Then number 2, you have deism. This would be the belief that perhaps there was a God or gods, but if there were, he or it or whoever created the world, wound us up, and then left us. And so essentially, he has no part in our lives today. Maybe a creator, but really doesn't care about us, isn't involved in our lives. So essentially, the way we live our life doesn't change whether he exists or not. So that's a form of atheism. And then the second would be agnosticism. Adeism you spell Deism, and agnosticism. Number 3 you spell Agnosticism. Okay, agnosticism. This would be the belief that whether gods do exist or don't exist doesn't really matter that much, and that maybe there is one, maybe there isn't. We're gonna leave this open ended. We're not sure, so we're not gonna bother about it. Maybe he does exist, maybe he doesn't. Kind of leaving it open ended. So those would be kind of the different ways of thinking about it. Those different branches, if you will. And as you'll see, agnosticism is often mistaken for atheism, and they go hand in hand, especially in the 15th, 16th centuries. But we'll talk about that a little bit more later. One thing to keep in mind: atheism isn't a new idea. Certainly has been around forever. It's Proverbs 14:1 says, "A fool says in his heart, there is no God." And so, that's Solomon. Solomon says this in biblical times. So atheism isn't a new idea. He's saying you're a fool if you don't believe in God. Well, of course, he can only say that if there are people who are saying. So long before Diagoras came along, and, known as the first atheist, people were challenging the belief that God existed. And so it's not something modern or cool that we came up with on our own. Ever since sin entered the world and lies have sprung up about God, including questioning his existence. Satan in the garden saying, "Did God really say this?" now turns into, does God really exist? It's not just, did he say something? It's, he doesn't exist to begin with. So it's not a new idea. So yeah, that's pretty much a quick flyover of the definition of atheism. And so then number 2, ancient to modern atheism. Ancient to modern atheism. Now, ancient atheism. So like I said before, the concept of atheism in ancient times was crazy. I mean, most cultures believed in this pantheon of gods. The Greek and Roman cultures, the first that come to mind, but also these rural city, tribes, and they all believed in multitude of gods. So it's like the idea that there was only one God. Christians, Muslims, Jews. Atheism was viewed with the same amount of skepticism and even persecution. You just believed in God. That's just what you did. And so atheism was just like this crazy concept, and then nobody understood people who didn't believe in God. It didn't make any sense. It was just a given that God existed, or that multitudes of gods existed. So the stuff that a few points to make that go along with this idea. Number 1, persecution. Socrates questioned the state gods of Greece and was killed for it. Okay. A guy named Anaxagoras was banished from Athens for believing that there was no God. He was banished. At one time in the ancient worlds, Christians were known as atheists because they didn't believe in the hundreds of gods. It was only after Christianity became the state religion of Rome under the Emperor Theodosius in the 300s AD that Christians were no longer labeled as atheists. So in ancient times, really, if you were an atheist, you didn't say so. And if you did say so, you were persecuted. Number 2, ideas have consequences. Now, this isn't only true of atheism, but we see this across history. An idea that challenges the way things are culturally, whether it be saying, oh, there's only one God, or whether saying, oh, there's no God, or saying, oh, the earth is round and not flat, etc. People rebel against new ideas, and that challenge them. People who challenge the status quo are persecuted, hence the term ideas have consequences. Atheism was no different. In ancient times, it wasn't, modern or accepted that there was no God, since polytheism was the cultural norm. And so people who challenge the status quo, and this is true in our culture too, are viewed with skepticism and outright persecution at times. And so, keep in mind, any new idea, whether it be right or wrong, any new idea has consequences to that idea. That brings us to number 3, skepticism. Now, this is the idea that this is the definition, is the theory that certain knowledge is impossible. So we all know skeptics. These are the type of people who see the glass half empty, who question everything and always doubt the truth of something. Me and my husband are a great example. I always see the good in something. I'm a glass half full type of person. Whereas my husband Eric, the glass is always half empty. They like an Eeyore type of person. Who's always grumbling about something, who's always kind of morose and sees all the bad and everything and questions everything. That was a theory. That was a philosophy, really, of thought. It was called skepticism. So when I say the word philosophy, I want to be careful because I want us to all understand what I'm talking about. So the definition of philosophy is the study of the fundamental nature of knowledge, reality, and existence, especially when considered as an academic discipline. And so philosophers, they've always questioned reality, existence, knowledge, and how we know something, and how we know something is true, how we know that we actually exist. They ask all of these existential questions about fundamental issues. And so philosophy in of itself is skeptical, raising a lot of questions. And so skepticism as a philosophy states that it is impossible to come to any certain conclusions regarding how we know anything to be true at all. So skepticism obviously gave way to questioning everything, including religion. So questions like, okay, is there really an afterlife? Do gods or God really exist? All types of questions like this concerning religion. These questions, of course, then led some people to say, no, God doesn't exist, which leads to atheism. Or if they said, you know what, there's no way to prove whether he does or not, so who cares? Throw up your hands. I don't know. That's an agnostic. So that's number 3, skepticism. That kind of led to this whole idea that we can question everything, which in turn gave rise to atheism and agnosticism. Now, number 4, atheism and agnosticism are not the same thing. So, like I said before, in those definitions, in ancient times, agnosticism was just as new as atheism. So, where atheism is, strictly the belief in no God, agnosticism leaves the issue open-ended. That's the difference. Atheism gives a definitive answer as no. Agnosticism is like, maybe not. Why do we care? For example, let's see, and his name was Protagoras. In 450 BC, Protagoras was famously quoted by Plato as saying, "As to the gods, I have no means of knowing either that they exist or do not exist." Okay, so that's an agnostic response to the question. This is not atheism. For an atheist would say, no, God does not exist. So people often confuse the two. And in ancient times, atheism and agnosticism were virtually the same thing. They hadn't really been separated yet. It started more as agnosticism, maybe, which then turned into no, it doesn't. But as time went on, it became clear that they were two different schools of thought entirely. All right, so those are some things about ancient atheism to kind of keep in mind. And then we come to B, which is atheism in the Middle Ages and Renaissance. Simply put, atheism was a dangerous belief the more powerful the Catholic Church became. It was simply unheard of to not believe in God. And if you were an outspoken atheist, you were shunned and persecuted. So this wasn't just true in ancient times. This was also true in the Middle Ages and during the Renaissance. It was just mind-boggling if you didn't believe in God. It was a given. I mean, think about our culture now, how the opposite is true. My, how times change. Uh, Middle Ages and Renaissance, you believed in God. That was just it. The Catholic Church was it. That was all there was. So that leads us to then number one, dominance of the Catholic Church. During this era, religious piety was common. It was the rule of the day. You attended Mass, you tithed to the church, and you partook in communion. That's just what you did. But there was also a very prevalent mysticism to the church. None of the common people could read often. They were very illiterate, and they relied on the priests to interpret the scriptures for them. Now, they also had a lot of occult beliefs that kind of got mixed in with this, and so they were superstitious, and they believed heavily in punishment from God, including sickness and death if you displeased him. So the church kept the people in obedience by holding the threat of hell and damnation over them if they didn't obey the church's doctrines. I mean, you've probably heard of this term before, but indulgences. They sold indulgences, which meant that you could buy an indulgence and therefore buy a family member out of hell. They did this to raise money for the cathedral that they were building, and Martin Luther spoke out against it because it was actually obviously contrary to the gospel. And so the Catholic Church really kept the modern people under their thumb, and they were just they were dominant during the Middle Ages. And so first you have the dominance of the Catholic Church, and then number two, you have scientific advances that led to questioning the church. Okay, so the Renaissances of the 15th and 17th centuries opened the door to further skeptical inquiry, as scientists began to use, growing technology and mathematics to challenge the views of the church. So it was a hard-held doctrine of the church that the earth was flat. And so when Galileo, who was a Christian, no less, proved that the earth was round, the church excommunicated him for his beliefs. Now, a lot of these scientists believed in God and were Christians, but a lot of them weren't. And so, during these centuries, it became more acceptable in academia to start questioning the doctrines of the church. And this had a trickle-down effect to the people. Generally speaking, the masses were still religious, but now free thinkers, such as Galileo or Leonardo da Vinci or Machiavelli, challenged long-held beliefs that were ingrained in the Catholic Church, and they challenged the systems that they used to keep people from asking good questions. Now, some of these free thinkers were Christians, like I said, but as people began to ask more questions, as they became more literate, and as they started to kind of realize that the Catholic Church really wasn't doing what Christ intended the church to do, agnosticism began to creep into philosophy and science. And by the end of the 7th century, it was once again a crime to be an atheist, which alone attests to the prevalence of atheism. If you can follow logic there, they had to make it a crime because more and more people were becoming atheists or agnostics. So that says a lot. So that's by the end of the 17th century. So that's kind of the Middle Ages and Renaissance. And this is a really fast overview. There's a lot more that kind of goes into it. But all right, that's the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. And then you have C, atheism in the early modern period. So now we're getting into the 18th century. This is where things started to get interesting. So number one, France. So by the 18th century, more atheistic philosophical works were being put out by French and British philosophers, mostly French. Some of their works were banned and burned, and that's mainly in France. A lot of these free thinkers and philosophers were mostly French, and who were asking the hardest questions and and being the most adamant about there being no God. And so their books were burned, they were banned, or the authors were imprisoned. Atheism didn't really reach, though, a common hold in France until the French Revolution in the mid 1700s. And so times were rough in the 17th century if you were a Frenchman, especially if you were an atheist. And so by the time the French Revolution came along, atheism was getting more of a hold. And so then number two, England and America. England and America. So the first atheist work written in English was published in 1811 by a guy named Percy Shelley. It was called The Necessity of Atheism. And books by Thomas Paine, such as Common Sense, challenged organized religion in general. So you got the guy, hey, okay, atheism is necessary, and then you've got Thomas Paine in Common Sense saying, well, no, not really pushing a pure atheistic agenda, more of an agnostic one, asking all of those questions. And so as more branches of scientific inquiry emerged, such as anthropology or paleontology, geology, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, science began to become more agnostic and atheistic as the existence of God was brought into question. Now, Charles Darwin published Origins in 1859. And so it is considered the most influential scientific work that directly challenged the idea of God as a creator. Now, Darwin was persecuted by the church for his beliefs. But soon as the 20th century emerged, it became more socially acceptable to challenge long-held doctrines. And so it wasn't just a part of being an elite thinker or a scientist or philosopher. More and more people were literate and reading materials for themselves and became more educated and were able to not have to rely on someone else to interpret material for them. Now, of course, this is a good thing. Being able to come to your own conclusions about something and to read something for yourself is a good thing. But it led to more and more people drifting away from this idea of relying on God and trusting Him as a creator. And we're going to talk more about evolution next week. But Darwin, after he published that, kind of opened a Pandora's box, really. For more and more people to see science as the answer to everything instead of the Lord. And it's had some far-reaching and devastating consequences. Because, of course, like I said, it's always good to read for yourself and to ask questions. But when you turn to your own head knowledge and turn to science or turn to this great philosopher who came out with this great work, I'm going to put all my trust in that. You get into some trouble. All right, so that was atheism in the modern period. And now, D, atheism in the 20th century. Atheistic philosophy started to be accepted not just religiously or scientifically, but also politically. So the rise of Marxism and socialism are fundamentally humanistic and atheistic. Now, part of your homework is to research Marxism, so I'm not going to go too far into that. But you start to hear some of these different words and terms thrown out at you. So number one, this is we're talking about the 20th century, the 1900s. Number one, you have naturalism. The definition of naturalism is a philosophical viewpoint according to which everything arises from natural properties and causes, and supernatural or spiritual explanations are excluded or discounted. And it became the rule of the day, naturalism did. And of course, this started to misplace the Catholic doctrines. And so philosophers such as Bertrand Russell espoused the natural world and science as the only things we can know definitively, since they can be seen and touched or reasoned in our own minds. God was no longer a given. He was marginalized and pushed to the side for human reason and our ability to understand science. And so that's naturalism. Then number two, humanism. This is an outlook or system of thought attaching prime importance to human rather than divine or supernatural matter. It gave way to the idea that our own intellect was all we could rely on, and that science could disprove the idea of the existence of God. Human beings were seen as the arbiter of morality and ethics, and that God, if he did exist, had no say in how we could live our lives. That's humanism. And you know, as we discuss these things, it's obvious. Like this is the definition of idolatry. You know, trusting in either our own wisdom or trusting in what we can see and what we can touch and prove with our minds and our own reason, and placing those things above God. Anyways, so yeah, that was humanism. And then number 3, political movements. So Soviet Russia became the first atheistic state as declared by a government. Russia declared that they were an atheistic state. That's the first time anybody did that, was Soviet Russia. And then Stalinism was an oppressive movement, founded by Joseph Stalin that violently suppressed religious movements. Then you had the People's Republic of China, or you had Cuba and Mongolia, and all these. They made atheism and suppression of Christianity a state policy. So the rise of communism started as a result of atheistic philosophies, Marxism, socialism. Atheism moved from a philosophical dialogue between people, and let me throw this out there. It said, one philosopher, the people started asking all these questions. Well, now it started to make its way into politics in the 20th century, and it had devastating consequences. Devastating consequences. Was the ugly underbelly of atheism. That kind of brings us back to the idea ideas have consequences. That's what atheism led to. That's what agnosticism led to, was these oppressive regimes and communism, Marxism, or and even Stalinism. And then you've got all these corrupt governments who persecute anybody who believes in God or doesn't obey the system. So that's kind of a flyby of atheism. Now, next week we are going to discuss modern atheism, kind of where currently. So we're going to talk about issues like evolution. We're going to talk about the term new atheism and the implication of an atheistic worldview. So things will get a little interesting. But if you guys have any questions, let me know. And I attached the homework, I think, to your outline, but in case you didn't, you're going to read about, going to take a crash course on Karl Marx and Marxism. You're going to write a couple paragraphs about that, and then you're going to read about atheism in America and the separation of church and state, and that's going to be interesting too, write a little paragraph about that. So, yeah, anyways, if you guys have any questions, let me know.